No mai hoki mai kia ora fold e mihi ne ko Duncan tōku ingoa. Back today with Glen Kyne.
Kia ora, Duncan. We're both looking like we might need a haircut after a long summer break.
That's exactly right. I'm sort of trying to eke my December haircut out for another couple of weeks, but we'll see how that goes.
I'm past due, it's fair to say.
We're going to talk today. Obviously, the media year started in a local context with a big bang of NZME's all-staff meeting, which led into a major sort of restructure, around 40 roles net to be lost and a bunch of things to flow out of that. I've been speaking to some NZME staff this morning, so I've got some sort of fresh perspective on that. We'll also talk about another very fresh and very sort of much still developing story, which is the DeepSeek AI model, which has caused huge chaos in anything that's connected to AI, most specifically NVIDIA, which is off about 17% as we speak. And we will talk a bit about just some sort of interesting issues that are kind of arising out of TVNZ earlier this year, early year performance, just a few signals there. That will be the bulk of the show. Just before we get into it, though, I just want to plug a live episode of The Fold, which we are recording at the Hannah Playhouse. It's live on stage with Bernard Hickey and Lucy Blackiston from Shit You Should Care About, basically talking about the creator economy as it pertains to journalism. Both of them have built on Substack, built successful businesses there, and I really like them both. I find the very different ways they're going about building out businesses on those platforms super interesting, and so to get them on stage to sort of unpick that it'll be super fun. So there are still tickets available. If you go to the spin-off, you'll be able to dig up tickets to that. Glenn, let's talk about NZME. Some pretty big news. I mean, it's weird now because of News Hub and because of the TVNZ news that followed it. Everything is kind of, from a scale perspective, measured against those. But, that's less than a year ago. A year ago, 40 jobs in journalism, representing probably 4 or 5% of the total journalistic workforce, would have been an enormous story and still should really be treated that way, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I still think this is a big story. NZME, of course, have not stopped refining their workforce with the downward pressure in the ad market over the last 12 months. What's interesting about this for me is a couple of things. One, timing, obviously, just coming back into the new year, and the fact that after, I guess, many years, I'm not sure how many you probably know the number, but a number of years of operating a paywall.
5.5 years.
5.5 years. A lot of data collected around logged in customers during that time, and then therefore the refinement of the workforce based on data analysis around what people are reading and willing to engage with and I guess pay for has been the big one. And therefore, a number of changes made to their operating model and to their journalistic workforce. Let's get into that in a minute, but you've been speaking to some NZME folks this morning. What did you learn? Yeah,
so essentially it's a net 40 roles being lost, which is quite a large number, but as the sources have pointed out, that is net. So the gross number, i.e. the number of people who will lose their jobs, is going to be higher than that. And that's quite profound when you think about it. And there's talk that a lot of it is going to be concentrated in terms of senior journalists, which, I think is causing it's been described to me as anger amongst the journalistic workforce, because they say that they've worked very hard to build a functioning paywall, like really the only one where for sure that this works as a product. They've got, I think, close to 150,000 people paying for either digital or a print digital bundle. That's a lot in a local context. And the sort of fury is that that workforce, which the explanation that was put forth initially was that they're going to be making less content, but better content. They're going to be reorganizing around hubs. All of that stuff makes sense. And even that if you're making less content, you might need less production. But this idea that actually it's a mask for stripping out some of the really senior journalists, and NZME has a lot of them, who really own specific beats. Things like, I don't want to mention names, but there are a whole bunch of key verticals where the sort of the acknowledged best in the country works at NZME, and if you pull them out, you'd lose something quite massive there. But the thing that's causing a lot of consternation is that the two things that NZME knows works. They know that paywall text-based news works for them, and they know that radio-delivered news works for them. Both of those are being sort of pulled back in favour of a move into something which feels speculative, and that's a sort of what's described to me as a video streaming product. I assume that's not an actual full-blown streaming news service, but it means a significant increase in the amount of video news that they'll be able to put on platform, but also distribute through social platforms.
I think if I just put a pure commercial hat on for a second, Michael and that leadership team, Michael specifically, last year, forecast to the market a profit downgrade. And so, he and that leadership team have a responsibility to do all things possible, to the benefit of the shareholders and get a return and get a dividend to them. So, with that lens and the data they now have around maximising the operating margin of the company at any given time, given the data, particularly given the data, you would say, good job, and necessary. But there's another side to that coin. And the other side is the tension, I think, between the craft of journalism in New Zealand and the pure commercial outcome that journalism is there to create for something like the Herald. And as you say, we don't know what sits on the other side of that at the moment. It could be a little bit speculative, but it can also be a slippery slope, because as soon as you start removing verticals or quality out of your product, you never know exactly how your audience is going to respond to that, and someone else may just pick that up.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. There's, if you're at the New York Times scale, you probably do know this. Some combination of sort of focused groups and even more advanced and grunty data analytics would tell you. But I do worry that what you have with senior journalists is very frequently their lower output. They're often writing investigative stories or kind of really crunchy, well-researched profiles, the kind of thing that you might, the frequency absolutely doesn't compete with what a punchy news reporter can put out. But if you take away some of those, that might well be, even though someone might only be reading that person's work once every couple of weeks, once a month, that might be the reason that they subscribe, And so when you're looking at either conversions or the sort of the amount of readership that proportion of readership that they represent, they might not look like that they meet their salary. You're not necessarily going to, that might be the thing that's actually keeping you on the hook. And I guess I understand and even, we try and strike a balance on this podcast between acknowledging the sort of brutal business realities that are driving these decisions, but also kind of critiquing the thinking behind them. And I do think that the problem with video news as a product, no one is disputing the fact that there's a big audience demand for it. All social platforms are now largely video first. The problem is that if you're paying for its production, you're automatically at a disadvantage to the people who have far more inventory than you, which is, obviously YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok particularly. And so I am concerned that they'll spend a lot of money building studios, a lot of money recruiting, both production side and whether it's training their existing journalists or recruiting people who are really adept at video storytelling. we've seen this movie before, the famous pivot to video of Facebook in the sort of mid 2010s. Will that ever get you sufficient revenue to kind of offset the cost? I still remain somewhat skeptical, because CNN right now is trying to figure out its approach here. So if they can't, with their volume, with the amount of video news that they make, figure this out, I don't know. I worry a bit.
Yeah, and I think the challenge with the platforms you mentioned, it's a 6 to 15 second grab of news that you've got to be able to nail and get the depth of the story right. That's incredibly difficult to do in a news environment. And I think, we've talked about it before. There's a scale issue in New Zealand, also to monetization, who owns the customer, the number of things at play here. But also what's really interesting, I think, in the competitive context is we have Stuff making a really big play for video news with an anchor product now in 3 News that they can leverage from, and with the talent, etc. You've got NZME making the investment and have a couple of high-profile people, including the likes of Michael Morrow,
Sarah
Bristow, who's leading the charge over there on their video and audio strategy. And you've got the kind of, this is not the right language, but the elephant in the room, if you like, of TVNZ saying we're going to pivot our entire news operation into a TVNZ Plus environment into the future. And to do that, to be successful, they also have to be able to nail how news turns up in a digital form, not just on a big screen TV, connected TV, but on that device in your hand.
That's a great point, actually, that it's not like NZME has sort of figured something out that the rest of the major newsrooms are caught napping on. TVNZ have every right to win this. Stuff is basically a year ahead in terms of putting volume in. RNZ, I'm not really sure, but they really should be going hard here too. There is, I think, as much as anything, a case for NZME saying we'll just let them burn one another out on that. The thing that's quite interesting to me about this again is that the paywall, as much as they've got a 5.5-year start, and you have to kind of give them their flowers in terms of what they've accomplished there, I still think that product needs work. And speaking to a journalist in NZME who's contrasting the experience, the customer experience of being on the Post versus the Herald, and the Herald as a digital product can feel like a bit of an unholy hybrid of stuff in the Post, in that it has some really great journalism on it, but it's giving you pop-ups, it's sort of shunting you down page because of an ad that appears at the top of the homepage. It's serving a lot of kind of empty calorie stories in amongst its quality things. So if you're a logged in Herald user, you're not getting a premium experience the way you are on the Post, or the perfect example being the New York Times. So I just wonder if, the fact that NZME is fundamentally at its core a sales organization. It has more salespeople than it does journalists. It is fantastic at selling across radio and across print, and is increasingly good at selling across digital. This feels like something that comes from a place of a sales-driven organization that wants more and better inventory in a digital context, not a subscription-driven business that is looking to improve the quality of, and therefore the total number of subscribers there. I don't know. That's the issue I have with it. Is I think at a certain point you have to pick a lane with your products rather than continue to pursue them both.
Yeah, and I think you've just described really well the eternal tension inside a commercial news organisation. 3 tensions. One, let's make as much revenue as we possibly can. The second, the story is dominant, the editorial strength. Or now, what we now have is a third tension, and what does the data tell us? And the data in particular can swing you away from the first two potentially. And so I don't think there's any right or wrong answer at the moment. I think they're trying to figure it out. Audience will certainly tell them, that's for sure. They will vote, eventually. But it is really interesting. I also think, just to pivot a second, I believe the News Talk ZB role in Wellington is now going to be merged or collapsed into the Herald Wellington team or the political team. For me, that was also really interesting. ZB has had such a distinct voice for such a long time. And inevitably, when you start to merge teams, do you start to see that voice change? That's another thing I'm interested to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think you can make a case for ZB, and certainly they have been using more of the Herald's journalistic talent. Yes, they have their own newsroom. Is there a future where that is a smaller and very much concentrated on top of the hour, but when they're looking to get sort of journalists giving analysis or explaining an evolving news situation, that you default to using a Herald voice? I think there's a good argument for that. It probably also increases the sort of salience and potentially the likelihood, propensity to subscribe, to the Herald for the ZB audience. But yeah, there is a distinct and separated news brand and news tone, news perspective amongst ZB that is different from the Herald, and you inevitably lose that as you start to collapse those teams together. One more NZME note, which this came out last week, but I think it's quite an interesting sort of nugget in it, and an instructive nugget in and of itself. So Between Two Beers is a real, if you'll pardon the pun, juggernaut of a podcast. Was founded in a Hamilton garage in 2019. It's two guys, two ex-footballers interviewing different types of New Zealanders. It's in some ways it's very much a kind of a mirror of some big podcasting international trends that haven't shown up that much locally, which is these less structured, really long-form interviews with people where they can kind of, it just leans into the sort of fundamental nature of podcasts. Their numbers are quite extraordinary. I think it's, by some metrics, New Zealand's most successful pure podcast. Certainly its most successful independent podcast. And for a long time, I actually, was under the misapprehension that this was an NZME product. In fact, they had the license to sell it, and the news that came out last week was that Acast, which is basically it's a host for podcasts that is sort of swimming upstream into actually monetizing them as well, has taken on the exclusive license to distribute and sell advertising around Between Two Beers in a local context. So that's NZME losing what was a big sort of what felt like a big part of its podcast portfolio to an international competitor. What did you make of that?
Really interesting, because New Zealand's a small market, and it would appear Acast breaking away from their MediaWorks relationship, where I think MediaWorks used to house their portfolio of content and distribute it and monetize it. So it would suggest in that sense that Acast have made a decision where they think they can monetize better on their own, which is really interesting in a small market like New Zealand for a global product. Traditionally, you would see them try and do a sales representation deal and keep doing that.
Well, it reminds you a little bit of, the quandary that WBD had with Sky, right?
Yep.
Like, do we launch Max here as a standalone, or do we leave a local to kind of use their customer relationships?
Yep. So obviously they've looked at the data and found out there's an opportunity on their own to go direct. And the thing that was missing was that investment in local content, where you're not going to get any better than Between Two Beers to be able to launch that initiative into New Zealand. And so I don't think this is going to be the last of what we see from Acast, trying to double down and build that local presence. And I think it is. Yeah, I think that really hurts NZME, actually, like to have something of that scale and presence in their podcast network. That's a big hit.
Yeah, so I mean, you also recently saw, I think it's SiriusXM, which is huge digital audio in the US. They've recently signed a deal with MediaWorks, which potentially slightly replaces Acast in that portfolio. But that digital audio space still remains, it's one of the few sort of fluid and competitive spaces in New Zealand, and that Stuff has been, it's got its relationship with Brody Kane and Kiwi Yarn, so they're still pursuing a kind of a partnership strategy there. NZME, by the looks of this, is kind of doubling down on its own content and obviously turning its attention to video. Because there is a parallel universe where they actually went all in on audio and said video is a sort of a too hard basket. But it basically what it does ultimately is just illustrate that there are parts of this market that are still very much in play, even as others are start to feel very mature.
And I still think the podcasting market is trying to figure out how to build a sustainable revenue model. Around the world, you saw Spotify go so aggressively into that space. I think $100 million plus for
Rogan, and Call Her Daddy,
for all of that sort of thing. And then a couple of years ago, start to pull back on that completely, shutting down a lot of their studios around the world. And I think you see this kind of ebb and flow that happens with podcasts around new formats coming to bear. True crime goes through its moments, right? But no one has yet figured out how to replicate what I would call a traditional media model, i.e. a lot of inventory turned over an extended period of time. You just can't recreate that in a podcast format. And so how do you monetize at scale and do that consistently?
Yeah, it's interesting. Right? Like I've noticed on a lot of the international podcasts I listen to, they're starting to have ads show up in a more similar, rather than the classic host read or it's being sort of hard inserted into the recording, they're being inserted in a more programmatic way, akin to a YouTube ad break. And so you're getting more local advertising there. You're getting weird things, like I've heard like a Nectar Money ad, and it's always repeated. There's always two back to back. If I'm them, I'm probably a little bit annoyed about that because I don't know how that's being accounted for at the media agency level. You can just, it basically illustrates that it's still very nascent, but it does feel like there will be a sort of a winner there and an approach that makes sense, because you've got a huge chunk of listening is going to be international that will be solved as an advertising, inventory problem at some point in the next few years. And then the local side of it, will it be direct? Will it be sort of warehouse alongside them? Is there any premium for local content? You'd hope there is, but you just don't know. So,
and I suspect, I don't know, we might get some feedback after the show, but I suspect that Acast are using a media agency in New Zealand to do the sales representation for them. And if that's the case, if it's one of the big globals, here's another example of global platform doing a global deal with a global media company, and none of that money is really sitting here in New Zealand hands transacting, other than potentially the sponsorship of the show itself that might, the creators might be getting a cut off.
Yeah, it's a very interesting space for sure. Let's quickly talk about the DeepSeek story. I mean, you're hyper engaged with AI. So what happened? I woke up to this that DeepSeek, a Chinese research-based startup, had managed to sort of match some of the OpenAI sort of bleeding edge benchmarks with a total budget of $6 million and an orders of magnitude smaller amount of NVIDIA chips, which kind of sent total chaos through the markets. Huge, I think the NASDAQ is off around 3.5–4%. But what it suggested was that the vast volume of investment into energy, into data centers, into chips that was required to be competitive at this level, that could be phenomenally overstated, which has huge flow-on implications, not least of which is because DeepSeek is Chinese, so the race between the US and China might be much more competitive than we potentially thought, and also that DeepSeek's open source, and that suggests that the sort of proprietary LLMs, which were sort of thought to be leading the race, that's very much an open question too. What did you make of that?
I was blown away. I think also DeepSeek have gone to number one on the Apple download store, blowing away ChatGPT. I think it's free, whereas ChatGPT, others, there is already some sort of subscription model in place. Just mind blowing and heavily, well, not heavily, but regulated by the Chinese government, right? So I think
they can kind of get around the regulation to a certain extent. The reason that they were allowed to do this and release it was because it was framed as research and not consumer facing within China. So it suggests that one of the advantages we thought that the US had in terms of generative AI was the fact that it didn't have limits on speech. But there is obviously this carve out where if you're sort of facing internationally, not available in a domestic way as a consumer product, you can still research and ultimately release into different contexts.
Yes, fascinating. I know there was a piece of research done on ChatGPT and also on DeepSeek around ethnic cleansing, two very different results,
right?
Depending on what platform turned up, which is suggest a heavy hand from government still. But I think the big story here, potentially, if it's true, right? And I think we have to preface this, is it actually true? $6 million investment, I think. They were second, if not tertiary, NVIDIA chips. So because of the export regulations that the US has with China around technology, these are what you would call substandard chips to what the Google, Microsoft, ChatGPT, OpenAI guys are using. I think $650 million was what Meta just spent. $60 million is what Meta spent recently in their investment into their latest AI LLM model. $6 million to be able to achieve a result that's faster, better, doing things more efficiently than the big guys is just mind blowing. Yeah. And if it's true, it's going to turn the AI world on its head.
Well, because so much of the last year, I think the US market was up something like 25%, and a huge amount of that was directly related to a tiny handful of companies with direct exposure to AI, on the assumption that everyone, all other large businesses would be spending money on subscription products that use that. And if now that becomes something that where the previously thought of the hard part of it, building the model, is kind of trivial, and then the cost of it is trivial, that flows out into energy markets, it flows out into, obviously into chip making, it flows out into geopolitics. Like this could be, you could have the AI bubble bursting, not because AI isn't useful, just because it's not valuable in the same way. And it can be a huge boon to productivity. It's just not, that'll just flow out into companies for cents in the dollar of what people were sort of predicting it might ultimately cost companies to engage with that.
Yeah, the geopolitics angle is enormous here because you've got a situation where the government ban on TikTok, which you've been covering. We know what's happening there, but the average business and the average consumer out there, particularly most businesses, they're not going to be going to build their own LLMs anytime soon, right? And there's these things called agents, and effectively what most businesses are doing are working with these companies to build agents, these things called agents that interact with their own data and their own systems. So leveraging the power of AI, if you like, via these agents. If all of a sudden the cost of doing business to build an agent is a tenth by using the Chinese DeepSeek technology versus OpenAI or Microsoft, people are going to go there. And when that happens, Chinese technology is infiltrating every piece of tech that is out there in the community. And so that has profound consequences. So it's going to be fascinating. I think the story is going to build and build and build, Duncan, over the next couple of weeks. My big caveat to this is it true? Yeah.
There's been, I was talking to my colleague Toby Manhire on the way in, who said there's been a suggestion that when you talk to DeepSeek and ask it what's powering it, it suggests that it's ChatGPT with a sort of a reskin. So this is a very early stage to developing story. It might be that by tomorrow or later in the week, it almost feels inevitable, there'll be a huge new wrinkle to it. Maybe that's a good opportunity to segue into, this is kind of to a certain extent related to the conversation Anna and I had last week about what the sort of new Trump administration's attitude towards both AI and social media and just general kind of the aggressive approach to trade and an expansionary posture towards its tech companies, how that impacts the likelihood of there being a sort of a meaningful new law in New Zealand around technology, whether that is connected to the Fair Digital News Bargaining Bill, or a sort of so-called Netflix tax, a Netflix tax around local production, all of those things which are sort of pregnant and wait and see from the government. What's your perspective on what's likely to go out there?
I think everything's up in the air. It's pretty clear that Trump's going to use, as inviting those global platforms to drive the messaging for the MAGA movement as much as he possibly could, and all of the potential downstream legislation that was coming at those tech companies. It'll be interesting to see whether that goes ahead or goes away. I suspect a lot of it will go away. The influence of these guys is enormous, and it's both supporting one another, right? The tech owners and their platforms supporting free, as they call it, free speech, where and Trump is able to get his message out, using those platforms. In New Zealand, if that's the case, we should be watching very closely, because the issue around the Fair Digital Bargaining Act will have, I think, less to do with sustainability of journalism, will have a lot to do with potential geopolitical pressure coming from the US, as the likes of Google and others say to the US government, hey, we don't want to have to be, forced to be legislated in these local environments. And it doesn't take a lot via trade agreements and other agreements for, a superpower to be able to wield influence and stop these things. And so it remains to be seen, and I'm very interested to see whether Australia, even though I applaud Australia and their government around a lot of the moves that they were making, whether that is able to now go ahead potentially, especially with an election coming up this year, and again the influence of the US government starting to go, you know what, we're not going to let these platforms be legislated around the world. We'll apply pressure.
It's a pretty terrifying kind of prospect, right? It's like if you have a White House which is happy to use a kind of madman theory of diplomacy, if you want to call it that, where nothing is off the table in terms of retaliatory or kind of proactive tariffs across any field that you like. And so in a local context, if you're thinking about any kind of legislation to grapple with, whether it's your tax base or the sort of information space in your country, that you have to triangulate that against a White House that is very comfortable just kind of throwing anything out there, and that the old rules-based order where you go to a WTO or your ambassador might meet with the minister and you kind of work something out, that's all off the table. And I noticed this morning, Bernard Hickey sent me a story out of Australia, the Sydney Morning Herald, talking about, which I've reported on last year, in a local context, banks kind of their increasing intolerance for the fact that they have to wear the cost of scams which originate on meta platforms, and they're getting quite strident with their tone in Australia. And that's, I think, a great thing, a really important way of sort of saying, hang on, these platforms that are now they're completely unpoliced. They're sort of had a policy talking about they'd repeatedly reported the same sort of scam account and had no action there. Now, as a regulator, the ACCC, which has been trying to make Facebook bear some of the cost of those scams, they have to consider the fact, or the government that oversees them have to consider the fact that if they try and make Meta responsible for scams originated on their platforms, that could have ramifications far beyond the sort of narrow field that they're trying to enforce it. It's just it's going to be a really chaotic year.
I think so. And every time Trump makes these decisions, outside of the historic rules-based order, it almost gives permission to all other centre-right leaning governments to go, well, it's happened there, so maybe we can, relax our thinking here. And I think that's the scary thing, right? Is going to sort of scope creep that potentially exists into the future, and the impact, therefore, that's going to have on journalism in New Zealand. I think we're going to be talking about this a lot over the coming months.
I agree. Now, to return to the sort of much more micro local context. So there was a press release which came out, I think it was last week, about the Black Clash, which is a Duco event. Cricketers playing rugby players in I think it's a charity match, might not be. But it's basically a good time. It's and it's a really well-made TV product. It rates incredibly well. And I'll just sort of read a section from the press release because I think it's both a huge achievement and it illustrates some of the things which are really hard about digitizing audience. So basically, it said the 7th edition of the match, which pitted a cast of current and former A-list rugby stars against their cricketing counterparts, reached 914,900 Kiwis AP5+, which was 20% of the total population audience, in a fun but competitive T20 match at Hagley Oval. It had a channel share of over 50%. So
phenomenal.
Which is just a stunt. I mean, you'll have seen that. That's a very rare.
I've seen it twice.
Yeah. So it just tells you how popular that product is. For linear TV audiences, the highest reaching and highest rating program for the day across all linear channels for AP5+. Again, to beat the news at all is a crazy thing, but that blows it out of the water and just shows how well they have turned that event into a phenomenon that's ahead of All Black Tests. That's just a crazy number. It's the second part which I think is really quite instructive and potentially chilling in some respects. So it said an additional 86,700 accounts were reached on TVNZ Plus, the highest reaching title on the platform for the week. Now that's a great number for TVNZ Plus. That's a lot of accounts, but it's also less than a tenth of the number watched on linear. So the most successful linear product of the week was the same as the digital product, and its audience was 10 times the size. And that is not an uncommon ratio for the linear 5+ audience to be about 10 times the size as accessed on streaming. And live sport is a bit different, right? Because a linear broadcast of a TV show can capture that audience over a long tail.
Yep.
But fundamentally, it just shows that a digital audience is orders of magnitude smaller than a linear audience, and yet you're trying to sustain the same scale company with that in the near future.
Yeah, my first I'm going to say annoyance with this is the two different methodologies of measurement. One is people, one is accounts. They are different.
Yeah, great point.
And accounts, I'm not sure what number TVNZ uses as a proxy. They will know through their own data, but it can be between sort of 1.8, 2.2 people watching per account, which kind of bolsters the number up a little, but not a lot. The theory still remains. It's still a delta difference.
Though you're right. That would imply 200,000 watching online.
Yep.
That makes it a fifth or
Yep.
more than a fifth of the linear audience, which is a lot less than below 10%, while still being nowhere near enough.
And if that number, by the way, is that's still a big number, right, on a digital platform. And I think that on face value, TVNZ will be thrilled because huge linear audience, healthy digital audience. They don't have a lot of control necessarily on what on everything they do here because they're not the event owner. I think Duco Events own that event. So Duco sell the broadcasting rights to TVNZ, and no doubt, I am sure, Duco enforce that there is a free-to-air linear play-out for that event. But therein lies the future challenge. As you're trying to build a digital video model and you are trying to run the traditional linear for maximum performance over time, but knowing you're going to transition to digital, you have to at some point start making choices, questions around, am I actually even going to play this on linear, or should I just have it on TVNZ Plus to acquire and bring that audience through? And, what the numbers are suggesting is they're a long way still from being able to maintain or reach those significant audiences, even for such a big live event as that.
Yeah, it's that is the sort of, a version of the choice, which is, they've been playing out with the international kind of companies, the likes of WWD and Disney Plus and so on, which have been trying to convert cable audiences to streaming audiences, is that, you get more money and the sort of short-term gain by running them on both platforms simultaneously, but you're actually going to have to, what you really want to do is move people to becoming a paid subscriber of your streaming product so that you can have a future-proofed business, and that might mean sacrificing some short-term revenue. Unfortunately for TVNZ, they're currently losing money and they don't have a pay product yet. I know that you're of a belief that one is coming still, which makes that choice even more difficult.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of and credit to them, a lot of trialing going on with TVNZ with different formats on TVNZ Plus right now, which is exactly what they should be doing. And I do wonder, we haven't heard yet about the outcome with New Zealand Rugby and Sky, but I do wonder whether or not, it's been pretty well signalled that, Sky were willing to pay less and New Zealand Rugby were going to have a delta. And I do wonder whether TVNZ will be playing a role in that delta with some non-exclusive rights that they start to carry, and whether or not they sit as free rights or whether or not they sit behind a paywall was going to be really interesting. And I think that story is going to close out pretty quickly.
Yeah, so we'll definitely be talking much more about the New Zealand Rugby situation. That contract may well be signed and just not public at the moment in the coming weeks. With TVNZ Plus, like as you said, you can see that they're making a lot of sort of tweaks and changes into it. Most obviously, you saw the way that news has become a much more prominent part of the platform there. I noticed last night I was watching Alone Frozen, one of my favourite reality shows, and it used to be that over a 44-minute TV hour, you might have 4 ad breaks. The frequency right now is, I'd say, at least doubled. Now, the majority of those were house ads, ads for other TVNZ products. That is on one level frustrating because, like it's not actually
good for TVNZ.
Well, it's good for TVNZ. But it's not generating new revenue for TVNZ, except maybe at an arm's length over increasing engagement with its platform. But what it does say is that they're trying to increase an acceptance of more ad breaks. It's more akin to TV. At times, it felt like it was beyond what you'd even get in a TV hour. And then they can just start to put more in those. But that's been a big problem there. They're just a far fewer ads showing on digital versus linear.
Yeah, there's a hell of a lot of work, I believe, going on inside TVNZ to optimize their digital ad revenue strategy. It's really complicated because if you've got a live stream of a simulcast live channel, you're effectively replicating your inventory in a digital sense. And if you imagine, doubling the amount of inventory, that has downward price pressure on it and is really difficult to maintain a premium. On demand is always different. And I think you were probably watching Alone on demand with more ad breaks in it. And that's interesting. So TVNZ always had less on-demand inventory running on any given show than what 3Now did, for example. And 3Now never really saw any drop-off in performance because they were running a higher ad load. So TVNZ are obviously pushing up into that space, knowing that there is more revenue to be attained. The way the technology works is when those ads are served, if there's not enough demand in the market, it will default to a house ad. So often when you're seeing lots of house ads, it can be a signal that actually there's not enough demand in the market right now, which also would be quite typical for this time of year.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that I'm curious about is TVNZ's been this sort of powerhouse of selling TV advertising, linear TV advertising, has still retained, it feels like it's actually increasing its share of linear TV audiences. I saw the Nielsen ratings for both 5+ and 25 to 54. It was one of the first weeks of the year, but there was nothing that wasn't TVNZ.
Yep.
No 3 whatsoever, and in 5+ there was nothing that. There was no Sky either. It was even Duke sneaking up into it with some cricket, but otherwise TVNZ2 and TVNZ1. Is that in part because the sales force is still so sort of focused on and motivated by linear advertising versus the digital, or is there something else going on there?
Yeah, partly. I mean, there is a inbuilt skill set, right? Legacy skill set there. But, I would say TVNZ do a pretty good job actually of selling their digital inventory. I think the real challenge, and this is the core of the strategy, right, is they need to be able to wind down that linear product but squeeze as much audience revenue and cash flow out of it, because that audience revenue and cash flow is effectively what's going to build TVNZ Plus. And that's at the core of the strategy. On the digital side, it's really difficult because every day there is more and more inventory being released into the market by different players. And so you're constantly having to reinvent and fight and invest more and more to stay relevant. And, even though I don't think, someone like Netflix is going to turn on ads anytime soon in New Zealand, you have the potential that if they did, that becomes a real roadblock, to the TVNZ Plus strategy.
Well, Amazon Prime has just turned on advertising in local context. So, it's a really tough business to be in. And yet again, just to bring it around to the top, it makes NZME's move into video news. It's a brave decision. We will see how it plays out. Thanks so much for coming on, and I think you're off again later in the week. So we'll chat again. I'm sure there'll be a lot more when you return.
Can't wait. Look forward to it. Thanks, Duncan.